All right, video 3 on China at its height. So I think we did the first part of the first third of the chapter, then I did a section on the Shang and Chinese written language. Now we're going to go from the Shang dynasty on into the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou dynasty rose against the Shang dynasty and defeated them in battle. Around 900 BCE, the Zhou dynasty began China's first great literary work that we know of. Again, not to say that there weren't others before this, but frequently you would see that Chinese was inscribed on bamboo or some materials that again don't stand the test of time. However, these did. The Book of Documents, again, pretty boring title, right? Well, around 900 BCE, the Book of Documents not only made record of taxable things as far as like population and individual, I guess, quantitative values. It also contained hymns and poems that paint a mythological, understanding of some of, or intertwining perhaps might be a better word, of aspects of Chinese history. So, in this book of documents, the Zhou and their battle with the Shang is frequently discussed. The Shang are depicted as just absolute barbarian, very savage types, and the Zhou are, of course, offering for what they would think of as at the time modernity or a better living condition. So again, very very stilted in the Zhou's favor. It's what happens when winners write the history, right? Keep that in mind. It comes up again throughout the rest of the semester. The Zhou writings also focus on a concept that combined earthly ruler with divine ruler. Again, this pre-existed in the early Shang dynasty. You saw that there was a connection between the monotheist, the god of choice, D-I, not sure how to pronounce it, one or the other. And then there was the ancestor worship brought on by the Shang leaders. Now, ancestor worship continued into the Zhou period, but at this point, you start seeing in the Book of Documents something that will lead to what we call now the mandate of heaven. Now, in this concept, the Chinese rulers were given a mandate, a right to rule from heaven. Now, in the case of the Shang, according to the Zhou, the Shang had behaved badly. They were bad rulers. They did not, rule on behalf of the people. They ruled on behalf of themselves. They did not bring, divine characteristics into their dictatorship at all. Dictatorship's the incorrect term, but we're going to go with it for here because they were very, according to the Zhou writings, very cruel and iron-fisted, even though iron wasn't invented at this point. But back to the point. The mandate of heaven dictated the way in which Chinese rulers from this time came to view their relationship to the people and how they should rule accordingly. A king must rule as a just king. Again, just. You got to be in, ruling on behalf of your people at the very least. Heaven had taken the mandate to rule from the cruel Shang and bestowed it on the Zhou. Again, according to the Book of Documents. The Zhou also focused on creating a bureaucracy of smaller states throughout the kingdom, as I mentioned in the course overview. Over the course of roughly 200 years, over 200 individual states would form. So, 900 BCE to about 700 BCE, you see an explosion in the number of small city-states and states forming that, again, all exercise some form of autonomous control over their own territories, but still ultimately answer to the Zhou chief. So, get to about the 771 BCE is the next point that I have of note in the Zhou dynasty, because in that year, so again, about 200 years after they start, or no, excuse me, that's bad math, about 350 years after they start ruling, you see that a Zhou emperor, I think it is at this point, or we'll just call him ruler at this point, is actually assassinated. And at this point, there is still some sense of stability. Another Zhou comes in to rule, but the Zhou would never be as strong again. So they would hold on to control for quite a while after this, through the Warring States period, but that would really be the end of the Zhou dynasty. Zhou politics and life during the Zhou dynasty. Next section of your notes. During this dynasty, a heavy focus was paid on the patrilineal passage of power. This extended to the passage of the nobility as well. So, a noble was born a noble, and then he passed his nobility on to his son. The title went with the family. This aristocracy could be in either civil service or in military service. However, all nobility were required to serve. These people became known as shi, S-H-I, not the highest of nobility, but they earned their respect through civil and military service, so above the commoner. They set, again, the middle rung of the social ladder, so to speak. Now, the Book of Songs, also circa 900-ish BCE, gives a depiction of the daily life of a person in the Zhou dynasty, both high and low. These verses range of the life of kings all the way through the lives of common people. They speak of laws and love, the ancestors, religious practices. Great social and economic changes, as I mentioned before, took hold of China around 500 BCE. So 400 odd years after we get this description of, daily life in the Zhou dynasty, we have a lot of, religious and philosophical developments that come to, shake up the system a little bit. And with that, in China, social mobility would come on the rise later. But at this time, we're just seeing the development of Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism. So all of these religions and philosophies will come to play a part in Chinese development, social development here in the next, page and a half of notes, but next 500 odd years of Chinese history. So in China, as I was saying, social mobility was on the rise with these new social norms ushered in by new philosophies. Changed the way that the social structure was viewed. It created a common level for a lot of people to exist on the same, whether you were born rich or born poor, in certain beliefs and philosophies of the time, there were answers, and answers led to, open discussion in a lot of ways, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Excuse me. In the southern kingdoms, especially the Chu, C-H-U kingdom, many new gods were beginning to be worshipped. So again, not just ancestors, but a change in religion. These religions and cults would spring up outside the central states that made up the core of the Zhou dynasty. So again, after the 771 BCE assassination, the Zhou maintained control of a lot of the central states, but you start to see a lot of malcontented rulers on the edges of the Chinese, area, the rulers of the smaller states. So again, these areas, back to the original thought, I heard my child crying in the background. He's fine. Someone else is looking after him for me right now, but it's still distracting. I apologize. The Chu were viewed as barbarians of the earlier age, kind of like the Shang had been depicted by the Zhou. However, the new religions that developed and new philosophies that developed in the Chu region became incorporated into all of China. So, very important region, Chu. The view on spirits living in this world with us was a common feature of Chinese religion. Again, ancestor worship, a concept we'll talk about in a few moments called filial piety, where a son worships the father, but the father, is still a son, worships his ancestors who are gone, etc., etc. But the thought of, these spirits being among us, I think would be a common way to say that, was not uncommon in Chinese philosophy and belief at the time. So, brings us to a new section of your notes, the Warring States period, from roughly 403 to 221 BCE. The growth in independence between the over 200 Zhou Kingdom states began to break down around 401 BCE, about 300 odd years after that assassination of the Zhou ruler. This time would see the centralization of smaller states into larger states, and many things affected the development. Over time, war and violence would take hold. More powerful states had begun to develop standing and well-trained armies. Again, something that's very important, especially in future parts of this course. You will see that with standing armies, there is a need to feed those standing armies, which means you have to go and take other people's stuff or land so that you can produce for your standing army, which then needs a larger standing army to go further into an empire, meaning you have to repeat that process, right? Vicious cycle. However, as it applies to China, we had a couple of inventions that led to this. The invention of the crossbow, for instance, changed the battlefield tactics dramatically in China. A key feature of the crossbow working came with metal working, creating a little trigger mechanism. So with that mass production of those trigger mechanisms, crossbows became very common. Unlike longbows and training for years and years and years to be an effective archer, crossbows come with a very distinct advantage of being kind of like modern day rifles in that you just kind of point and click. You can train people to be good at that much more quickly than you can train an archer to be accurate and effective on the battlefield. So much so was this invention was thought so highly of in China that it was frequently reported that a crossbow user could equal over 100 other soldiers on the battlefield. So very fast, very effective weapon, changed the dynamics of the battlefield greatly. The use of mounted cavalry, again, chariots were an earlier invention. They were, again, the access point of nobles and above to use chariots. You might have some cavalry if you had a particularly wealthy ruler that could afford that in his standing military, or not even standing military at the time, but just kind of have it in reserves for when he might need it on the battlefield. However, chariots very expensive, very detail work, hard to make, not hard, but takes a lot more resources. People on horseback, however, ride very quickly. They're very mobile, and it doesn't take nearly as much training to be an effective horseback rider that then can use an arrow or bow and arrow or crossbow in some cases from the back of a horse. So mounted cavalry, again, very effective at this time against people that did not have it in their small states. Larger states started overtaking smaller states. Now, these two inventions, among others, tactic changers, were especially common in the Jin kingdom, and that is where horses kind of became a measure of military power. So we had the Chu kingdom, where a lot of the early religions and philosophies around 500 BCE were finding their voice. Well, in the Warring States period of 401 to 221 BCE, about 200 years of history there, you see the Jin kingdom kind of coming to prominence. A lot of that had to do with their use of the crossbow and the horse. So, along with military developments, violence, you also have standing armies, again, to perpetuate that violence. How do you feed them, though? Well, you can conquer other people's, take their food, but that's a, finite resource. What you need to do, and what China did at this time, was develop new ways of, getting more food per acre, developing better farming techniques. In so doing, you see a lot of the southern Chinese developing irrigation techniques. Again, those all-important rice paddies. Rivers and streams diverted to change the course to where they flood at specific times, or keep a constant supply so that more rice could be grown. More rice, more food, stronger army, more fighting. Remember, vicious cycle. Many military leaders at the time, again, Warring States period, followed the writings of Sun Wu and his book, or I guess writing, The Art of War. This, again, along with crossbow, along with horseback, cavalry, etc., was one of those battlefield changers, the way that tactics were thought of. He wrote, and what many of the generals that led troops followed, was that discipline was essential. Heroic sacrifice, on the other hand, self-sacrifice, was useless. The key to success in a battlefield, or I guess now a lot of business leaders read The Art of War and take it to heart for whatever purpose they think, but deception of one's enemy is essential. So, you think they're going to attack over here, they're going to attack over there. If you want them to attack over there, then you make them think you're over here. You always make your enemy unsure, and in that case, you always have the upper hand. So, if you can maintain that stance, it's very effective. So, Sun Wu's The Art of War became very, popular read. It's really the world's first, not first, but one of the earliest, especially in this part of the world, page turners, perhaps, might be a good way to think about it. China, especially during the Warring States period, also came up with the world's first population census. And this established, the traditional family names in China. They functioned as taxation records, keeping track of professions, and they became the start of, again, ways for a government, in this case, the Zhou and later the Jin and several others afterwards, used this idea of a population census to tie people to their professions, to their property, to the land that they worked or the job that they did. That way they knew exactly how many people they had, what goods they would have, and how to tax the people. It's very effective, but again, earliest writings typically revolve as much around telling stories as they do keeping cold hard facts. So not uncommon in that way. The world's first population census, just covered that. So, who came out on top in around 201 or 221 BCE? Well, the state of Qin defeated the 7 central states that had formed over the 200-year warring period, 200 states down to just 7, so pretty dramatic odds. The Zhou dynasty had been centralized into a lot of capital cities, meaning that when you centralize power in that sense, and then you have an invading army and armies coming in this case, kind of know where to go to get the important people. You go to the capital city. If you can conquer that, then the government becomes decentralized and you can take over a state very quickly. Well, the Qin were very smart in that regard, and they did just that. I guess the next section of notes we're going to discuss will be Confucius and his followers. Again, several of the philosophers throughout this time we'll discuss in this section of notes. China was the birthplace of Confucianism. Confucius lived circa 551 to 479 BCE. Got to be a nice old man. This period was known as a time of the 100 schools of thought. India and China were both witnessing the rise of many new cults and religions. The main question, how to balance nature and man. That's what a lot of the Chinese philosophies and religions revolved around. Balance. How could balance then be extended into political and social life? Again, all things that Confucius and his followers and several other philosophers sought to answer. Confucius was a court member in the kingdom of Lu, so again, came from some standing. In this role, he already advised a king, but the king was not interested in his advice. Thus, Confucius and his followers began to travel to other kingdoms, seeking a ruler that would listen to them. Focus was on the role of each person and their service during life. So each person had a job to do inherently, like they were born with a place to fill. And the, key to Confucian philosophy is you're seeking to fill that purpose. He longed for a more simple life where people simply filled their mind with nothing beyond what is needed to fulfill that natural role. The idea of Ren, R-E-N, became core to this concept. And it was, again, your place and the desire to strive to fill your place. Generally, according to Confucius, humans were born good and knew, in general, right from wrong. The example that I have always heard is Confucius would argue that if a human was walking along the road and saw a baby balancing on the edge of the well, instead of letting that child fall into the well, everyone would walk over and save the child. Now, you don't know this child, it doesn't do you any good to do it, but there is an inherent good in people that would say, go and save the baby from falling in the well. That was Confucianism. Followers, such as Minicus and Junzi, centuries after Confucius's death, so kind of like famous artists, he only got popular after he died, adopted teachings from the Analects, or what Confucius, he wrote down. They became known as the Analects. They preached the virtues of ethics and public service, they being Minicus and Junzi. The teachings also led to a common sense of, again, what we discussed earlier, filial piety. So break the word down. Filial, son. Piety is, worship of a higher power, pious in nature. So the son worshiping, again, son worship, if you will, but it's the worship of the father. It's, again, patrilineal. You worship the father, not the other way around. This is the worship of the older generation by the younger, especially son to father, as I just said. So, with that, I'm going to pause this video and go and again take care of my son for a few minutes, and then I'll be back in just a few, and we'll finish up this chapter. Very good.